Well, everybody, welcome back to the Bible Breakdown Podcast with your host, Pastor Brandon. Today, Esther chapter 9, and today's title is The Beginning of an Annual Party. The beginning of an annual party. I want to ask you this question as we get ready to get into this. Do you have anything in your life that you celebrate annually, never fail? I know some people would say, well, my birthday, of course, but not everybody celebrates birthdays, especially the older you get, you're not as excited about them. Or maybe there's certain holidays that you just celebrate more than others. And we're going to get into that in just a moment because I have a challenge for you by the end of today's podcast. But of course, as always, before we do that, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and the podcast. Thank you so much for everybody that does. Make sure if you're listening to the podcast, you take just a moment and you rate the podcast. Make sure you rate it a 5-star, please. And also leave us some encouragement that for others who are looking to see if this podcast is for them, they can be encouraged. And I know that we have a lot of people who listen on various different podcast apps and Spotify and all that kind of good stuff. If you don't mind, especially if you're on an iOS device, could you go to Apple Podcasts and rate it there? It really does help in the algorithm. I was searching the other day and I was searching in Bible podcast and we are nowhere near the top. And I want other people to find out about this community that we are building. And the only way we do that is we get rated and that kind of stuff. So it would help us out a lot. And I'm very thankful for it. Also, make sure that you are going to the Bible Breakdown discussion on Facebook. Because, man, the more we dig, the more we find. And I want to say thank you so much to those people who are doing a wonderful job putting out those posts every day. It's such an encouragement to be able to read. Well, if you have your Bibles, I want to open up with me to Esther chapter 9. Remember, the overall theme of Esther is that God is always doing more, and he uses a mess to make something beautiful. And we're going to see today one of the things that was made out of this. It's actually started a national holiday that they celebrate every year, even to this year right now. Before this year is over with, there is a holiday called Purim that they're going to celebrate this year. And it's amazing. And it's a wonderful thing that they do. And we're going to read this together and see how this holiday got started. And then I have a challenge for you today. So you ready? Esther chapter 9, verse 1 says this. So on March 7th, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. But no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces and the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. So the Jews went ahead and appointed on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews killed 500 men. They also killed Veshadatha, Delphon, Ashvatha, Poratha, Adalia, Adanatha, Parashata, Arashia, Aradia, and Vasatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not take any plunder. That very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther and said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, what has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it. So if you notice, pause real quick. What happened is there were all these enemies of the Jews that they may or may not have even known about. They just were there, and they had to just deal with it. They got enemies all over the place. And now they have an opportunity that if anybody attacks them, they can defend themselves. And notice what happened is they now find out all these enemies are all around them. And they get attacked, but none of them is able to overcome them. Wow. That's amazing. Number one, it's sad to realize how many enemies they had. And then number two, that they were able to take care of themselves. That's powerful and amazing. Verse 13. Esther responded, if it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do it again tomorrow, as they have done today. and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. That's extreme. Verse 14. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa, and they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. Then the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8th and killed 300 more men. And again, they took no plunder. So, in other words, their goal wasn't to rob these people, but to conquer these people. It was to defend themselves. And so that's what they had a chance to do. And so now, verse 16, meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend their lives. And they gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them. But they didn't take any plunder. This was done throughout the provinces on March 7th, and on March 8th, they rested, celebrating their victory with a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th and again on March 8th and rested on March 9th, making that day of feasting and gladness. So to this day, and that's still true, the rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate the annual festival and holiday appointed in late winter. When they rejoice, they send gifts of food to each other. Verse 20, Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate the annual festival on these 2 days. When he told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, and by the giving of gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So, the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called Purim. That's where the name comes from. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire and Haman and his sons to be impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why the celebration is called Purim, because it is an ancient word for casting lots. So, because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared that they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days and at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and the cities of the empire. The festival of Purim would never cease and be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what had happened ever die out among the descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. These letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time. They decreed both by Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther. The people decided to observe this festival just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. You remember, by the way, that was what? Before she went in, they fasted and mourned in order to prepare, right? So, last verse. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was written down in the records. Wow. What an amazing moment that God turned something so sad, so terrible, and just took a mess and made something beautiful. And we got one more chapter, but when the story first began, it was horrible. I mean, they were going to be slaughtered just because one guy hated them so bad. And now they have a national holiday where that whole plan backfired and something amazing happened. So what can we do with this today? I think it's so important, especially in the generation we live in where things happen so fast and there's just so much going on that it's easy to forget how good God is to us. And it's so important that we remember what we're thankful for, because if we're not careful, I don't know about you, let me just talk about myself. I will go from one problem to the next. And when that one problem is solved, in my mind, it's okay, one less thing. Let's go to the next one. I just go to the next one. If I'm not careful, I don't stop and say, thank you, God, for what you've done. As a matter of fact, there was a place, we've already read this in the book of Joshua, when the nation of Israel went over the Jordan River into the promised land, they took some stones from where the Jordan River had dried up, and they put them out on the bank, and they set them up, 12 stones, as a memorial, so that every time somebody passed by and one of the future generations said, hey, grandma, grandpa, mom, dad, why are those 12 stones there? It would be an opportunity to tell the story all over again. I think we should do that in our life. And so I think there's lots of things you can do that for. Certain times when you experience certain things from God, certain times, whatever. But here's the one I would love for you to do. Do you know, if you're a Christ follower, do you know the day when you were saved? Do you remember the day, month, and year when you gave your life to Christ? Started off as a day when you realized at some point in that day, I need Jesus. I'm a sinner. I'm on my way to hell. I can't pay for my own sin myself. I need salvation. That's a bad day when you realize the depth of your sin. But then it's turned into amazing joy when you experience the forgiveness of God and to realize you've never been more loved than right now. And when you begin to realize that the greatest miracle you could ever hope for, you've received salvation. Do you remember that day? I want to encourage you to do something. If you don't, then guess. Get as close as you possibly can. But what would it look like if you took that day, and as many others as you want to, but make a memory? Set it. My spiritual birthday is October 26, 1996. And I don't always do this really well, but even this chapter was convicting for me to go, you know what? There's other moments like that. Another one for me is February the 5th, 2012. That was the first day of our church, Real Life Church.